I don't want to say I'm ADHD. It's hard for me to say that. It's hard for me to say my brain doesn't work the same as everybody else's. I'm ashamed of that even today, and I know that all our brains work differently. I know that I shouldn't be. But I feel terrible about it. I always think it's going to get easier. And it does in adulthood. It does, because you have so much more control over your environment, but it never goes away.
Hi, welcome to It's All in Your Head podcast. I'm your host, Jackie Colbeth, and it's great to be with you. Today, we are going to be talking about ADHD with Timothy Denevi. Tim is the author of Hyper, A Personal History of ADHD, which was the first book of its kind about what it's like to be a child with ADHD, and among the first boys of his generation prescribed medication. Alongside his personal experience, Tim also traces our understanding and treatment of ADHD. He received his master's in fine arts and nonfiction from University of Iowa and has been awarded fellowships by the McDowell Colony and Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Tim is currently an associate professor at George Mason University and lives near Washington, D.C. Tim is an inspiration to so many, and we are so excited he took time out of his very busy schedule to chat with us. Tim, welcome to It's All in Your Head.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. I'm really excited to talk today. I read your book, Hyper, and immediately wanted to reach out. We've got a lot of people in our audience who have lots of questions, different inquiries, suspicions that they might struggle with ADHD. So it's a subject we're all very eager to learn more about, especially since it would be considered newer in the DSM. So wanted to talk to you and get your experience, strength, and hope.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. So I think it's super helpful, usually just for context, kind of giving the audience an idea of what childhood was like, probably specifically more around the time of when different symptoms may have manifested, and don't want to give too much of your book away. But if you could describe to us a little bit about what that was like.
Yeah, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1980s and 1990s. And, after the DSM-3 in 1980, codified ADHD kind of toward our understanding of it today. Diagnoses kind of went up across the board. And I and many people in my family tend to be more overactive, more physically active than, the baseline 5 or 6 year old. And so my situation was at the ages of 5 and 6, I was not just overactive, but there was a lot of conflict related to it. And some of my earliest memories are about these kind of moments of peak emotion where I, wanted something and wasn't able to get it, and or was frustrated and found myself in what we call a tantrum, from the outside, but from the inside, was almost like a religious experience, or was a kind of separation from the world around me. It was just a fit of intense emotion, and my mother, who's wonderful, and I'm still very close to. She brought me, as I think many parents then and today do, she brought me to the pediatrician that we've been seeing. And the pediatrician kind of addressed my situation with a one-size-fits-all approach. And at the time, Ritalin, methylphenidate, was being more widely prescribed. So I was prescribed Ritalin, and it turns out a higher dose of Ritalin than I think, than I know. I probably should have been, and I experienced a very adverse response to it. And that kind of began my journey during childhood through a medicalized and psychological approach to dealing with these behavior issues. And some of them were very effective, and some of the doctors I worked with were incredibly engaging and good, and some just kind of saw me as another number in the larger group, and I didn't necessarily receive the individualized attention that's so important when it comes to a situation like this. And I began writing about it, in my late 20s. I was a creative writing student and a workshop at the University of Iowa for nonfiction, and I was thinking back to some of the first memories that I ever had, and they were often related to what we now call ADHD, what we called ADD then, hyperactivity, and something that I've been, for good or ill, engaging with my entire life.
Yes. No, thank you for that description. It's sometimes difficult during childhood. I myself was a very, the word emotional child was used a lot. Reactions were not probably congruent, right, with things that were going on. I can certainly relate to that. How did it impact your I know, and gosh, your mom does sound amazing. Having read the book, what an unbelievable woman. What was it like interacting with family members at home? And then also too, at that time you were in school. And so I'm wondering what relationships looked like, both the dynamic with your family and then also to friends and peers at school.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. With overactivity, or with ADHD, it's often more like a tunneling effect. Whether it's activity related or not, you kind of go down into the moment that you're in. And when you come out of it, you can realize that your behavior has been very difficult for the people around you, but you may not have realized it right in the moment, right at that time, until you see the reactions. And so it was hard in a young family to kind of displace so much time and attention from my younger sister, and also from my parents, who were trying to establish their young lives. They were in their mid-20s when they had me, so they're in their early 30s then. And the struggle is complicated because, one thing I keep in mind now about ADHD and about mental illness in general is that, unlike the kind of Freudian approach of the 20th century and the late 19th century, we're not blank slates. We don't all start at the same place. And so some dude could be putting out an enormous amount of effort just to be sitting next to you. And they look completely fine and are sitting next to you, but we don't realize that their starting point may not be the same starting point as other children or adults. And, with peers, it was difficult to establish relationships. And then you have the initial behavior, you have the initial overactivity, and you have the secondary responses to it, and how that complicates self-esteem, self-worth, and, establishing friendships and connections. So childhood was I had a lot of privileges. I had a lot of advantages, but I came from a family where my father was a professional baseball player. My grandfather was a professional baseball player. My mother, had done some acting and been in the theater, and it was difficult. It was a difficult path. We didn't quite have the resources that can make situations like this easier, where you could be in a 10 or 15 person classroom at a private school, or you can have a doctor that will initially see your child in an individualized and specific way, and kind of won't compound things by just fitting them in to the general approach at the time. And so if you don't have those resources, it's a struggle from the start, and it can be a struggle with those resources too. It's such a complicated space.
Yeah, it's definitely. And I think too, to your point, even those, I've always thought, with the resources, of which I can relate to you on that. I come from a very resourceful family, and I was privileged and gifted to have those. But ironically, and I think it's worth mentioning, the healthcare system, I think, and I'm wondering if you agree, but I think it's set up in a way where sometimes even the best care is within a system that seems like it's not very well oiled. They're kind of working for every single party within it.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, difficult. I talked about this when I had shared my story on the podcast with bipolar 2 disorder. And I remember saying, the difficult part in childhood, when symptoms manifest and, you're under the care of your parents, and we're lucky we had very involved, tuned in parents, but it's a system that's set up sometimes where there's hurt that goes around maybe unnecessarily if people were maybe differently attuned to deal with things. But even the people we love most, who support us most, the ill part of the design is these parties are sometimes getting hurt and difficult to have relationships with it on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think especially with ADHD, I live now in Montgomery County, Maryland, by NIH. There's a good book called We've Got Issues by Judith Warner about children and parents and medication. And there's a confirmation bias that you can see here, where if you have the resources to get the $1,000, $2,000 test, go through these, extreme assessment, not extreme, but complicated assessment procedures, if you're spending that much money as a parent and you are worried that your child has ADHD, I think you're much more likely to get the diagnosis of ADHD. There's benefits that come with it, having more time in school, and those are necessary for so many children. That being said, that confirmation bias isn't necessarily helping. The child isn't necessarily helping find the best perspective and assessment in that moment. And, I've seen it here. I think it can be really dangerous. And so I think it's a good point that it's not necessarily having or not having resources. It's about the difficulty of this kind of boundary disorder, where what do you do with 5% of children that are really struggling with attention or with overactivity? How do you find out exactly what's going on? How much of it is environment? How much of it is biological? How much of it can be dealt with non-medical means? How much of it has to be addressed after everything's kind of been pursued, or at least tried in a medical way? And it's really tough, and sometimes the more we see, the more engagement or resources we see applied, it can even get muddier. And so that, I think, gets at that underlying difficulty of this border where personality and environment meet, like most issues of mental illness.
Yes. No, beautifully said. I couldn't agree more. And so you have these resources. You're seeing doctors. They're trying different medications. You have a supportive family, obviously. Did you start to see a benefit upon incorporating that as a form of treatment? Was there a point where, kind of within the throes of this, where you were like, okay, I'm starting to feel a little better with X, Y, and Z as the routine? Wondering where and when you started to see relief from all of this.
That's a really good question too. It would be year by year. And I think most parents dealing with ADHD are now adults that have gone through the more medicalized space of ADHD in the 80s and 90s would attest to this. I had a wonderful psychologist who emphasized cognitive behavior therapy after the issue of the prescription of Ritalin, the overprescription of Ritalin. And I think cognitive behavior therapy helps. It's not going to make everything better because there's no opportunity for being cured when it comes to something like this. It's not like a virus that you have that will get better, with the right approach, or a bacteria. Like this is something that's kind of at that boundary, or the signature of personality. And so cognitive behavior therapy did help. What helped a lot too was, when I was in a Catholic school with 35 kids in the classroom, if I had a teacher that was experienced and capable, and I would put more demands on that teacher, could still kind of navigate it in a way that was beneficial for everyone. And I had a better year as a kid. I had less of the secondary issues of, self-esteem, doubt, and all of that. But if I had a teacher that was really overwhelmed, no amount of cognitive behavior therapy would necessarily make that environment work. Everything would continue to get exacerbated. And so it was kind of hit or miss for a few years. And then eventually, getting into middle school, things got really tough with the changes in environment. I mean, the changes that, like any young man or woman is going to experience in terms of body development and puberty and brain development. And, I ended up then in my teenage years being prescribed nortriptyline, which is in the family of amitriptyline, for the secondary issues of depression, self-esteem, because there had been so much conflict for so long. And there had been years where it was mitigated and better, but it eventually kind of began to build up. And so that was then really difficult for me too, because, as a teenager, taking something that is so technologically complex as psychotropic medication, you're either, going to get better on it, then it wasn't you who made it better. Or if it can't reach down into that deepest part of you and improve things, then what's so wrong with you at kind of your center, at the heart of you, that nothing can fix? And either way, it's a kind of crippling lack of agency, especially at that formative space. And so, again, it was a struggle. It was very difficult.
Yes. No, I didn't start to feel better about my diagnosis until I felt like I was having some sense of agency. Definitely relate. I remember I was misdiagnosed as bipolar 1 for a period of time. And they were pumping me full of lithium, and I kept getting lithium poisoning, which is something, that can occur. So I remember giving a presentation at work. I was at the Chicago Tribune, and it was toxic levels. And I can feel I almost felt like, these drugs, I can't drive home enough. And I appreciated that you did. They're incredibly strong. They are these legal prescription drugs are incredibly strong. And if you're on one that isn't, if you're having bad reactions, that can be, kind of a scarring traumatic experience. Going through that whole medication process too. And I always ask guests this: do you think a lot of it, sometimes, oh, hi, Darla, do you think part of it too sometimes is expectations when you're diagnosed with something and they say, I have a medication for this and it will give you a sense of relief and, life can get better. And we kind of have these whack expectations well, this will make it better. This will make it better. And then when it ultimately doesn't make it totally better, to your point, we sometimes go inward well, this was supposed to help. It can't. Am I unhelpable almost?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. We don't quite, when we talk about medication and mental health, factor in or really have an approach to the concept of chronicity. It's repetition. It's the fact that it won't go away, and to the way that these drugs affect individuals so differently. And so another person, a family member, could take lithium or Ritalin and have a completely different reaction. People that are the closest to you as you think can be. And that's why there's such a complex technology. The brain is the most complicated thing in our universe. Is it too complicated to understand its own complication? And these, in the 20th century, new forms of technology, we have the ones that have been tested and that have been FDA approved. We also have the psychedelic movement of the 1950s and 60s, which see that as technology toward wisdom and insight and consciousness expansion.
And that's kind of coming back.
I know. And it's complicated, but what they're doing is they're all like the lobotomies of the early 20th century, reaching down into the most complicated space. And they're not scalpels, they're blunt tools. The harm with, something like nortriptyline or even, Ritalin, it's not the same as the harm in the irreversibility of, a frontal lobotomy, or even of electroconvulsive therapy.
Right.
But all those things are just kind of shaking and shuffling, what it is inside of us. And we can see with some of these drugs that for 80%, they'll kind of react to this. People will react this way, and they can improve the situation. But to think of mental health as something that just gets better through the application of medication is to radically misunderstand what's being treated. It's not a virus or bacteria. It's the brain, and there's really nothing more complex that we engage with. And I always found, since my experience, in high school and childhood and adolescence with psychotropic medication, whether they be stimulants or antidepressants, that took a long time for me to come to terms with the fact that there's no such thing as being healed.
Right. And expectations, for me at least, I almost wish someone had framed this in the framework, and because this is how I frame it to people now too. I have this, it's a little extra work. Not every day you're going to feel like $1 million, but if you work hard to understand what you're going through, knowledge is power. And you use the word agency, which I love. And did you notice when you started the project at University of Iowa and you started the book and you're doing all this great research in the book, and full disclosure, one of the reasons I love Tim's book is because he's sharing deeply personal lived experience, but he also too did the academic work in really understanding, and you can read it and get a lot out of it on a very factual scientific basis, in great juxtaposition to the personal experience. As you kind of started to dig in, was there anything that you learned either about the treatment or just that space and time, or something about ADHD that maybe you hadn't understood before? Was there anything that you uncovered and you were like, wow?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. I mean, I saw the book as sort of a form of testimony. It's not providing answers, because I think that's part of the problem with ADHD in the first place. Like, you can't just change your diet and all of this is going to be better. This is, again, at that signature of identity. It's what makes us us. It's something bigger than the sum of its parts. So what I found to be really fascinating was, in some of the research, the realization that ADHD was more of a tunneling experience. That you go into moments where everybody else thinks you're scattered and out of it. What it actually feels like when you experience it, whether it's an attentiveness or hyperactivity, is to kind of submerge and then kind of come up and realize that not everybody else was on that same slipstream or path. And when the literature kind of finally began to listen to the subjects of inquiry instead of just grouping them together, that kind of emerged, and the second thing is that we have to keep in mind that the history of psychiatry and psychology, the history of mental health, is often pendulum-like in its path, where we're swinging between causal explanations of experience and biology, and we're swinging between a new theory and then the response to that theory. And there's much more movement and instability in the path toward we arrived at today, like with most intellectual subjects. And so people have worked really hard to get to this point, but there's still so much we don't know, and there's still so much that is being figured out and that we'll never know. And finally, to get back to that point of testimony, what really surprised me was, in the early part of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, and up through the middle of the 20th century, and I'm sure today too, the way that doctors just saw their subjects almost as like inhuman problems to be solved, or as static conditions. These boys that were, at a orphanage, or these children that were being given like heavy tranquilizers once they were invented, and that disconnect, that dispassionate approach. I understand it in a medical sense, but this is something that goes beyond a strictly medical approach. ADHD and dealing with mental illness, especially in children. And I was just struck by their humanity. And I writing it, I had the feeling they never thought somebody who's their subject could assess their work.
Right.
And, and they never thought that they would ever be held accountable by somebody who they were judging, and could be judged in return. And so that's why I made sure to read I hated it, but I read every single word that, an early 20th century, late 19th century doctor wrote, instead of just reading the summaries or snippets. And I don't want to read articles from the Lancet or articles from American Psychiatry, the Journal of American Psychiatry, but I was driven to do that because of that sense of, of testimony, of being judged and wanting to be able to provide a perspective that I don't think they ever considered might be said. And I don't think that would happen today. I think we're in a more complex state, but it was the case in the early 20th century, to say the least.
Absolutely. I often felt like a guinea pig for Pfizer or Merck. As a child, you feel like a bit of an experiment. And I tell people, well, if you feel like an experiment, what impact does that have on your self-esteem? Like, I'm here to kind of just be tinkered and toyed with, and maybe we'll get like the right combination of Jackie or Tim after, X amount of time. And that becomes really disempowering. And being able to come to the table. I mean, that's why me and my family even started MedCircle, Tim. Like, you really nailed it. It was the feeling of when I walk into a doctor's office, psychiatrist in my case, I don't want to feel like, some broken, unintelligent girl who's, got issues, and you're there to kind of like, judge me or fix me. There's nothing worse to me than feeling like I don't have agency or I feel helpless. And it was such a beautiful way for you to put that, because it wasn't until I scoured, and at the time I was researching in early 2000s about bipolar 2. There wasn't much about it. And I, like you, was suffering through journals that were, made for people who loved organic chemistry and were pre-med, and was just nothing about me was like that. But I knew in my heart of hearts that this was explainable to people. What I didn't realize was it's almost better explained by the patient than the doctor. But we're just talking to doctors all the time. It was a rare instance I really got to speak to someone else with bipolar 2. Have you met anyone, along your travels that you had met with ADHD and said, oh, wow, like, hey, you get it. You get this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of family members,
Okay.
I remember reading not just, I remember reading about, there was a young man in Toronto who had talked about the experience of being medicated and being assessed. And I felt, that's someone who understands the way the assessment itself affects how you can respond. I'm always going to be overactive. Even as an adult, I'll be more restless than most. But as a child, I was overactive. But there was also the way I responded to the response I was getting or assessments I were getting. I think one of the scariest things is with mental health professionals, one of their talents can be to be more of a dispassionate investigator when an assessment is going on to try to figure it out. But in that dispassion, it can feel when you're in the office with them that they're just trying to look for the breadcrumbs or incidences that will confirm the thesis they may already have. But we're not a crime scene, we're not a puzzle on the floor to be put together like a jigsaw. Like that's not that's to be treated dispassionately like that. While that might be a good way to arrive at a diagnosis, can also, when you arrive at a misdiagnosis, when the person's not getting to the right, the assessor's not arriving at the right place, can compound it because you feel so used and not heard and overlooked in that moment. And to feel them pulling a version of you towards the diagnosis they want to make when you're trying to say it's not like that. We're trying to say your child is actually more complex than that. And you see them shutting off those complexities to just figure out what they want to say and confirm. That's a terrible feeling. And it happens, and it's why this is such a complex issue, because it's not as if, we're put in front of a camera that with its thermal, sensors will tell us what's going on. We have another person as complex as us. We have another subjective lens trying to figure out our subjectivity, and they can go by their guidelines, but of course they're biases, and we're going to come into it. We're going to react to the way they're reacting to us, which may confirm what they already believe, or complicate in a way they're not seeing it correctly. And I just think that it can be so streamlined. And at one end, you have the streamlining of feeling like you're a chemistry experiment. But even at the beginning point, you have this like terrible sensation that all these aspects of you are being broken up, and only the ones that fit the diagnoser's thesis are being reassembled into this version of you you don't recognize. And especially when we talk about, a place like where I live, Montgomery County, people are paying a lot of money to get that assessment. Absolutely. And maybe the parent has a bias and thinks that that's what it is. The child can be pulled in that direction. And as an adult, it happens too. It's, we say it's complex, but that's just an empty word. It's the experience, as you've talked about, of dealing with having something treated and assessed that is so complex, and your personality tied to it, that I think often gets overlooked.
And I have to imagine there's such a high misdiagnosis. I remember being in probably around the same time you were, we're around the same age, being evaluated and tested for ADHD. And I was probably 8, 9 maybe at the time. And, I remember at the time not really knowing what it was, just knowing like, who the hell is this person? Why am I looking at this? And why are they asking me these questions? This is all very, but okay, we'll go with it. Right. And I remember the doctor coming out, and I kind of thank them in hindsight, just because, they had said to my parents, I appreciate why you thought Jackie, may be struggling with this, but, she does not have ADHD, in my opinion. She just is willful and wants to concentrate on what she wants to concentrate on. And if she doesn't, she's going to be unfocused. But that could have easily, if they have a different recommendation, Tim, I guarantee you, with that bias, I would have been put on, Ritalin and given that diagnosis, and it would have stuck. But I think the healthcare providers, to your point, while it's important to have somebody, looking at something objectively, mental health isn't like the orthopedic surgeon. I didn't, blow out an ACL here. You don't need, addressing this in strictly medical terms with no real sensitivity around the emotions and experience just seems like, setting someone up to fail.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that always drove me crazy as a child and as an adult is when, a doctor might say, well, that's the normal dosage. Your reaction is out of the norm. This isn't a shot of penicillin, like this is a more complex thing, and I think that kind of, stutter you can get from a medical professional. And, this is just in certain cases, but it's when that approach we see in general medicine, like an orthopedic surgeon, like a blown out shoulder or knee, is brought to personality, which is again at this intersection of our environment and who we are, our biology. Really, the most complex, one of the most complex spaces that we try to change and treat, within the human experience.
And I make allowances, right, for people that I like or people that I love. I have a friend who struggles with ADHD. And the thing that's so great about it is, if I'm feeling like they're, a bit scattered, or they're just like, hey, I'm not like really focused. Okay, cool. Like that's so-and-so. That's who they are. I love them regardless. And if I have to give them an extra reminder, or I don't get upset if something, slips their mind, because I know how active their mind is at any given time. That's part of the reason I love them, and it's just kind of part of the package deal. Was it hard for you? Obviously, I have a friendship with this person and we share each other's struggles. Was it hard for you when it came to like taking it outside the family and sharing it with people that you cared about? Was there any sort of fear of, often I hear a fear of like, okay, I'm scared to tell this person that I like because I'm afraid they won't like me back because I have this diagnosis.
Yeah, I mean, my whole life, there was a fear of that. It's something I've always struggled with. I still struggle with today. I don't want to say I'm ADHD, and it helps to do it. Like I'm a college professor, I help run a graduate program. I teach creative writing students that have come from all over the country to study at my university, study writing. And, I have to tell them sometimes, I'm like, it's not personal if I didn't write or respond to that email. Please just email me again. Don't feel that my lack of response was a form of responding. I honestly do not mean to, and they've been really good about that. I'm just sending a reminder. Just let me know again. And it's hard for me to say that. It's hard for me to say my brain doesn't work the same as everybody else's. I'm ashamed of that even today. And I know that all our brains work differently. I know that I shouldn't be. But I feel terrible about it. I wrote an essay recently about when I was doing publicity for my last book, and I was on a podcast, the Joe Rogan show, and we were talking. Yeah, this is in salon, and we were talking and talking, and it got into like, well, do you take Adderall? And I was like, yes. And my first book is called Hyper, so I thought he knew that. But all I had to do was say in that moment, I have ADHD. This has helped me in my life. This is one aspect of the way I approach the world. I also rely on rhythm and exercise, and other options to treat my mental health. And I, as an adult, have that agency to do it. But ADHD is the reason I take Adderall, and I just didn't want to say it. I didn't want to say I have ADHD. And I have found that really, I understood it, but I also, I felt bad about that too. Cause I've spent, 4 decades with this. And I always think it's going to get easier, and it does in adulthood. It does, because you have so much more control over your environment, but it never goes away. And it just always floors me when those issues that existed at the beginning of my sense of memory, and the first things I ever recall experiencing, are happening again in a different form in the present.
Right. And you sharing this though, just reminds me of, saying I share your insecurities, but when I step outside myself and I think of my friends who struggle with different mental health issues, specifically my friend with ADHD, what I would want to say to them if they were saying, what you are right now is, I don't care. And I mean that in the best way. I don't care what you're diagnosed with. I don't care what your label is. Are you a decent, kind human being? Great. Call yourself, whatever it will. So I think it's worth noting, as uncomfortable as that is, if we take ourselves outside of that, I know I personally, it's like, okay, like, great. Like that's just part of the deal. But I appreciate that. It's certainly, I wasn't looking to run around, with a big banner, highlighting, having bipolar 2 disorder, even struggling with alcoholism. And I remember when I'd go to 12-step meetings, I'd say, why do I have to say my name? Why do you start every meeting with my name's Jackie? I'm gonna, it seems a little rote. Like, we get it. We're all here. Why do we need to be saying this all the time? And someone just looked at me and they're like, because it can be hard. They're like, look at you. You don't even want to say it. They go, it can be hard. So Jackie, it's just practice, and I know, at least for myself, like, yes, I don't maybe love this, but at the same time, talking about it more, doing things like what you and I are doing today and having conversations. I know that's helped me. I have to imagine you've helped infinitely more people.
No, I think this is, you're exactly right. Like, talking about it in this way is so important, because ADHD is not necessarily just a term or a diagnosis.
Right.
It's an explanation. It's a narrative. And if we see that as a way of explaining how we gotten to the point we're at today, it's not something we use to stop the conversation. It's something that we use to further it and to, begin it in a new way. And I think that's what we lose when we think of, medical or mental health terms. We think that it's just the container is the thing contained, and that's not true. When I say I have ADHD, what I'm talking about is a past that's led to this moment. And I'm talking about, as you mentioned earlier, something that people can look back on their own lives and say they've had similar experiences, but didn't quite have a way to tell that narrative, have a way to explain it. And I think language fails us so often. It fails us when it comes to ideology. It fails us when it comes to the medical field. It fails us when it comes to psychiatry and psychology. But if we see it as a starting point, these terms, and not as somewhere we end up, and it can be such a helpful, navigable tool within this complex and difficult world.
Yeah. Well, Tim, you're a best-selling author now. What does life look like for you today, after giving us such an awesome description what it was like to go through this? What's life look like today for you?
It's complicated. I think that, as we've said, you have a lot more agency in adulthood. And so, exercise is key. Yep. repeated rhythms are key. I take, as I said, extended release Adderall today, and finding the right titration of that is really important.
Yep.
And I never, there's no key, there's no cure-all. There's nothing that's going to unlock and make everything better. I have children. I find the hardest thing. I have a partner. I co-parent with my ex-wife, and I find the hardest thing is to just balance all the different demands with the resources that I have. And I think that's part of ADHD too, is in adulthood, everything kind of gets flattened. And so you can't say like, I'm going to do this and I'll do that, and I'll do that third thing. And then finally I'll do the fourth thing. They all call out to you at the moment you arrive home or the moment you need to do something. And it's so overwhelming. And then you look at your resources, whether it's time, or finances or stamina, and you're just like, I can't meet what is being, demanded around me, and I'm not going to be the person I want to be. And I have to step back from that secondary space because I really do get overwhelmed. Especially trying to be a father, be a good partner, to be the writer I want to be, and find time to do that, and to work full time, as a professor, and help my students become the writers that they can be. It's still a struggle, and the more success that you have, the more demands for me personally. I then feel on the space that, I define myself through, and whether it's creative or whether it's personal. And so I'm constantly reassessing. I'm constantly, I think I have to live more in the moment and not think this is not where I want to be, or this is not where I should be, or how am I going to do this? Those are all more rhetorical questions, and we're plagued by those. Those are a natural way of looking at the world. Living in the moment is so much more important. And I that's a kind of productive or pedantic way of saying it. But when it comes to being overwhelmed, which I think is a key aspect of adult ADHD, and that is actually a very important thing to remind yourself of.
Yes. So if there's any advice that you could give to someone who's watching this right now, let's say they've been recently diagnosed with ADHD, or they think they might have ADHD, and they're like in the trudge part, what advice is someone who's put the work in and helps so many other people? What advice would you give that person?
What you're experiencing is real, and there's so many other people who have gone through it too and questioned it in the way you may be at that moment.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I can't thank you enough for coming on. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. As I said, I love your book. I want everybody to go out and buy Tim's book, Hyper, because it just gives such a beautiful explanation, and you're so emotionally articulate, Tim, which is something, there are a lot of people who are articulate, but maybe not as many people who are as emotionally articulate as you are. So I certainly appreciate, all that you do for the cause of mental health and education and taking agency. And it was great talking to you. I wish you all the best.
Yeah, Jackie and I really appreciate what you're doing. It's been a wonderful conversation. And I'd say the same. I appreciate how you're able to, not just articulate, but put into perspective, these issues that so many of us are dealing with every day in different forms, but kind of on the same path. And so I really do appreciate it.
Thank you all for joining today's conversation with Tim. If you visit MedCircle.com, you can access tons of other conversations, including weekly workshops with our credentialed doctors, an award-winning video library featuring almost 1,000 educational videos. Become a member of our community today. Visit MedCircle.com to learn more. And thank you for listening to It's All in Your Head.